Welcome to Online Resource. In this video, we are going to learn SQL Server clustering from scratch. So, keep in mind, this is going to be a playlist. I have to put down right here high level identity to going to in this playlist. So, our first item is preparing cluster nodes for SQL Server installation. We do have a checklist contained before detail, and we will be using the checklist right here when we do the demo. So other high level identity is we'll be learning creating cluster, verifying cluster, adding shared disk to cluster, install a SQL Server on the cluster is still up, and active and passive active configuration overview, how to failover simulation, and also looking at cluster events overview. So action item, this is our checklist. Action item, first action item, we have selecting number of and obtaining their IP addresses. Keep in mind that any node that you wanted to add to your cluster is a static IP. In my case, in this demo, I'm using two nodes, and I have two nodes right here, TBS node 1 and TBS node 2. So their IP addresses. Number two, cluster name and IP address, and create cluster, basically logical object that contain all your clustering information. So that needs to be created in your DNS, and IP address, and must have to have IP address. And in my case, the cluster name is TBS 2012 cluster, and IP address 192.168.60. So if you using the cluster to install SQL Server in clustering mode, you need to MSDTC services, and it gets some install as an application. Anything that gets an install cluster application, that you have to have a static IP address in my case, and TBS MSDTC, and my IP address is 192.168.63. So preparing all nodes that are participating in cluster. This is the basically highly to see a SQL Server. So this checklist right here, number 4, is executed against any node any node that you preparing for SQL Server installation. Let's go through this item. First item is failover clustering feature. This is Windows feature. In my case, I'm using Windows 2012. Any node that you're planning to add in your cluster, you used to have failover cluster feature install. Number 2, since once preparing this node for SQL Server cluster installation, distribution transaction become mandatory, and be installing that Windows feature as well. .NET Framework 3.5 is mandatory, because without that our SQL Server installation going to fail. As for communication, two local area network, one is external, for external communication between organization network and your nodes and cluster. Number 2, local area network private, also known as heartbeat. This use in communication between your nodes and nodes only, between your nodes only. And shared disk, we will be use and shared disk, as in my case I'm using a one shared disk as SQL Server log, take BD, and backup devices. For if applicable, SQL Server shared disk for I have to SQL recommended to use for shared disk. One for SQL Server data, another SQL Server log, and SQL Server TMDB, and backup devices. So all these disks need to be presenting all the nodes such a planning to have in your cluster. Once the cluster is stood up, you're ready to install SQL Server in cluster mode. So SQL in instance planning to have more SQL Server instances. SQL Server, each instance need a separate static IP. In my case, I'm going to one first 192.168.1.64. that is for my one instances. If I install another instances, so I have another static IP address. So it still have separate IP address for instances. So Next up here we will learning create cluster, verifying cluster configuration, communication, active passive and active, add a disk to cluster. um, we will be learning how to add a disk to the cluster, and failover disk, and distribution service prior to installing SQL Server. Install SQL Server instance, active passive on node 1 and create node 2 as failover node. Installation as we talk about right here. So configuration setup for active and active for SQL Server I have been talking about as far as the SQL Server clustering modes, that what it means comes to active and passive configuration. This is a checklist that we can use to execute against any clustering, whether 2008 or 2000 SQL Server clustering or 2012. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.